welcome to the first 2012 series of Centre for Public Policy Forums. Really good to see so many people here for this first event, which will be dealing with governance hotspots in Victoria. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to any other Indigenous Australians present. And as I say, we have got a lot of people who've signed up for this event, so please be patient if people trickle in, even though we've started. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Helen Sullivan, and I've been in post, and in fact in Australia, just since last September as the Director for the Centre for Public Policy. And over the last few months, I've been familiarising myself with my surroundings and finding out from fellow academics, policymakers and practitioners what the key issues and challenges are in public policy and public administration, and how the Centre might be able to seek help address them. Those of you who are on the Centre for Public Policy mailing list will have a sense of what I think some of the pressing issues are from my monthly blogs. And I'm grateful to all of those of you who have responded to those blogs with thoughts about what you think CPP can usefully contribute. To those of you not yet on the CPP mailing list, please do join. That way you can get early notification of some of our upcoming events and also have the opportunity to participate in our discussions. All it takes is an email address, which you can either leave with us or you can register via the website. The Centre for Public Policy, I've discovered, occupies quite an important place in the affections of policymakers and practitioners in Victoria from all sectors. People have a very diverse set of connections to it. I bump into people who are former students, people who've been participants in events such as this, people who've contributed to courses, and sponsors and beneficiaries of our research. The legacy of its former directors, Brian Gallagher and Mark Considine, is a huge advantage to a new director, though the challenge, of course, is always how to build on it. The Centre for Public Policy public forums are a key part of the Centre's commitment to engaging with and learning from the worlds of policy and practice, and I'm delighted that we are able to continue this tradition with our 2012 series, which is being launched tonight. Appropriately enough, for those of you who haven't seen the sign, in the Brain Institute. We'll be running forums monthly in the first instance, and just to give you a heads up, future speakers include Dr. Helen Suzuki, the Race Discrimination Commissioner for Australia, Victoria's Chief Justice, Marilyn Warren, and Tony Nicholson of the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. Which brings me to tonight's launch event. We wanted a session that would deal with key challenges for public administration and for public governance, but from a slightly different perspective. We wanted a session that would bring evidence to bear on some of our more vexed questions, but not from an academic source. And we wanted a session that would speak to a range of participants while also offering something challenging. We think we've found all of these things in tonight's speakers, who will be concerning themselves with the question of governance hotspots. Mr Pearson is Australia's longest-serving sitting Auditor-General and has had a public service career spanning 4 decades and 3 Australian jurisdictions. Each year, the Victoria Auditor-General's Office undertakes a rigorous programme of performance and financial audits of public sector bodies. And since 2009, and this is what got me interested in it, the Office has interrogated this extensive evidence base to identify common weaknesses and problems in public service design and delivery. The VAGO's analysis focuses on a number of key questions. Are public sector managers experiencing the same kinds of problems in different contexts? What are the most common challenges to good management and good accountability? And are there patterns emerging from the audits that highlight challenges across the public sector? And what can managers, leaders, legislators do about them? In his presentation to us this evening, the Auditor-General will identify the key themes to emerge from a recent review and explore some of the questions and challenges he thinks they raise for us as public administrators, public policy professionals. Mr Grant Hehir, the Secretary for Treasury and Finance, will offer a response to the presentation, drawing on his department's experience of working with the VAGO. Mr Hehir has been Treasury Secretary since 2006, prior to which he held posts as Secretary to the Victorian Department of Education and Training, Deputy Secretary Strategic Economic and Social Policy in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and the Deputy Secretary of DTF's Budget and Financial Management Division. So we have a hugely equipped and skilled presentation team this evening. And I just want to say a word about the format. Mr Pearson will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and Mr. Howe will then respond immediately, offering a response based on the presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes. We will then open the session up for questions and discussion, focusing on the implication of these contributions for public governance and public management. And we hope that you'll be able to join us in continuing the discussion in the reception that's going to follow the forum this evening. So welcome to you once again, and I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Des Pearson. Des.
Thank you, Helen, and yes, I think I'm mic'd up, people can hear. Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you everybody for taking the time to attend this evening and participate in this new experience for me. And I'd have to say it's a new experience in a couple of ways. I'm a bit unsettled. As auditors, we normally don't get to speak first. We tend to be the last one along. And then normally we're commenting on Treasury and Finance's statements, not them having the first right of reply. So, and also when I look at the response list for tonight, it is quite an extensive list. I'm pleased to say there's some colleagues from my office here to help me and bail me out of the hard questions, so I put them on notice. But also I see a good spread of people representing the agencies we audit, academics and members of the community and various other interest groups. So let me just summarise that it is quite a pleasure to have this opportunity to share the work of my office, and through the discussion and debate, hopefully, that will stimulate us to go further. But moving on and just checking the next bit of technology, the business of the public sector. I start from the context, I like to contextualise it, that the Victorian public sector is a very large and complex business. And I suppose a tangible way of looking at that is that with more than 260,000 employees, revenue in 2010-11 of a bit over $61 billion, assets in the order of $250 billion. In anyone's context, I think that's large and complex, especially when you overlay that is comprised of about 550 entities. Again, putting it in comparison, because we don't work in isolation, we're a vital and important part of the state sector and the Australian economy, but I like to draw in comparisons. And when I go and look at the largest Australian companies, it suits me to pick number 3 at the moment is Wesfarmers, which is a large conglomerate covering retail, mining, insurance, energy, and undoubtedly a few other sectors. Look at their revenues, and they're $54 billion. Staff around 200,000, but about 40 billion in assets. So, yeah, depending on how you look at it. If I go to number 1, BHP, 62 billion, about the same revenue, but about less than half the assets, 104 billion. So again, in any context, managing and delivering services in the Victorian public sector is a very challenging task. But even though we say it is a challenging task, the community, the public that we serve, expects prudent use of these funds, because our money is largely collected by involuntary taxes and charges, and our remit is to expend them in the public interest for the common good. So there's a real big expectation on us not only to do the right thing, but to continually and consistently demonstrate we're doing the right thing with those resources. And again, when I draw the parallel, I'd argue in relative terms it's easier in the private sector, because performance there is largely measured by the bottom line. And a dollar wasted reduces profits, and suboptimal performance is usually corrected by management or the market by removing the underperforming management, restructuring the business by merger or acquisition, etc. So I'd summarise that there's more objective measures in place in the private sector. They've got a competitive marketplace to keep them honest and keep them on their toes, and the regulator is visible when I think in terms of ASIC and APRA. Turning to the public sector, the revenues, as I've already said, are raised by taxes and charges on the citizen, and the fact of life is they'll never be sufficient to meet all the identified needs, because when we put our taxpayer hat on, I don't think there's many of us volunteering to pay voluntary tax. So the challenge we have in the public sector, though, remains that a dollar not spent, a dollar wasted through mismanagement or underperformance, while it doesn't reduce a profit, it reduces the money that's available to meet competing priorities. And that means We don't get a new school, a degraded road doesn't get upgraded, an abused child is not cared for, training is not provided to a new paramedic or a police officer, those sort of trade-offs. In the public sector, again, before I move on, I'd suggest it's more challenging because the performance measures are more subjective and judgmental, and I'll start off by asserting there's less visibility of the regulators in terms of keeping the system honest, and we don't operate in a competitive marketplace. And while we employ many market-based mechanisms, it's not a competitive marketplace. Nevertheless, there's many checks and balances in place to measure and improve the performance of the sector. Probably the ultimate check, and a very blunt one, is that every 4 years the community goes to the ballot box and elects a government. And in Victoria we've seen that instrument exercised in just over 12 months ago. But moving on to my core business, which is audit and accountability, the role of my office is an element of this system of checks and balances, and that's to provide assurance to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the public on the accountability and performance of the public sector. Now, I suggest accountability is important in both the public and private sectors, as by definition it's reporting back to those who charged you with a responsibility, acquitting that responsibility. In the public sector, however, it's not only about integrity in managing performance, but it's a cornerstone of our democracy, as keeping the Parliament and the public properly informed enables them to properly exercise their judgment and powers. To assist the Auditor-General hold the public sector properly accountable, there are a number of protections in place to guard the independence of this role. Basically, the Constitution Act makes the Auditor-General an independent officer of the Parliament who is not subject to direction by anyone in the exercise of his or her audit activities. The Auditor-General also can only be removed by resolution of both houses, and changes to the provisions relating to the Auditor-General can only be made by way of a referendum because it's in the Constitution Act. These protections allow VARGO to conduct audits independently, objectively, and as my oath of office requires, without fear, favour or affection. Turning to our clients, the Victorian public sector is comprised of 550 diverse agencies, as set out on this slide. Through our financial audits, we look at the financial statements of each of these entities to annually give assurance over their reliability and fairness. These financial statement audits seek to answer the question that Parliament asks about how much when it comes to public sector money raised and spent. Our targeted performance audits examine how the Victorian public sector is going in delivering the programs aimed at achieving the government's objectives. This tells us about how well the public's money is being spent. And through these audits, we shine a light on performance issues in the sector. As Auditor-General, I have no executive authority and cannot direct the public sector. The only sanction available to us is to expose issues by reporting to Parliament and thereby placing them on our views and conclusions on the public record. So occasions such as tonight are a great further opportunity to shine the light and share with you, representatives of the public, what our audits are finding. And a requirement under our legislation is each year we produce an annual plan outlining the office's work for the coming year. During my tenure, we've developed this requirement and developed a practice of specifying audits of financial and performance audit interest over the ensuing 4 years, thereby providing a rolling 4-year program of audits. Choosing performance audits topics is an inexact science, but there is, I can assure you, rigour to our process. We do thorough environmental scanning and extensive stakeholder consultation, and through that we develop a list of topics to consider, and we assess and align these topics against the government's stated objectives. Under the previous government, we aligned our audits with the whole of government policy termed Growing Victoria Together, and you can see the objectives set out there. Under the present government, we have aligned our audits against the 5 goals for a stronger, fairer, safer Victoria, as outlined in the Governor's speech at the opening of the 57th Parliament. I suggest the strong overlap between the 2 different sets of goals again demonstrates the stability of our democracy that we enjoy. To fulfil our annual plan each year, I table reports in Parliament on the results of our audits, dealing with the findings, conclusions and recommendations of both our financial audits and our performance audits. In 2010-11, we tabled 30 performance audit reports and a further 6 reports based on our financial statement audits. And I want to stress the importance of these financial statement audits because they're the foundation and underpinning of our system of accountability. And we can be justifiably proud that in Australia we've got overall a very reliable system of stewardship. And basically, we, over my tenure, have broken these financial reports into 6 reports to break down the sector. There's 5 sector-based reports on financial statement audits, 1 on portfolio departments and related agencies, 1 on the hospital sector, another on the water sector, 1 on the education sector, and a 5th one on the local government sector. And then the capstone to those reports is the 6th report, which is the report on our examination of the whole of state's finances, and that's our report on the annual financial report of the state, the consolidated whole of government financial statement. Now, across these 36 reports, there were 198 recommendations made to audited agencies. Although our primary purpose is to provide assurance to the Parliament through our risk-based and targeted audits, more and more, though, we seek to add value, leveraging on our experience and knowledge to help the public sector make the most of our audits. In 2009, we developed a new and significant way to add value through our audits, to make these hundreds of audits and recommendations more accessible and relevant to managers. We analysed our year's audit program to distill the key themes or governance hotspots. Basically, we considered that if our audits were finding common and recurring functional and structural weaknesses in the areas we audited, it was probable that generally many other public sector managers were experiencing the same kinds of problems, albeit in different contexts. This year's analysis was based on the 2010-11 audits, and we identified 8 hotspots, which I propose taking you through tonight. And my hope is in presenting these addresses like tonight, it promotes awareness of these challenges and encourages greater preventive action by managers. I'll now move on to the themes. The first theme is about managing the performance of outsourced services. Over the last 20 or so years, the sector has moved considerably and the way it does business has changed dramatically. More and more, government is turning to the private sector for service delivery to improve efficiency, get better results, and for its investment. If done well, this can mean financial savings, more innovative approaches, and better quality services, which is good news for us all, whether we're a manager or a taxpayer. However, across both our financial and performance audits, we found that agency approaches to contract design and its management often created gaps in accountability. Worryingly, this often led to gaps in accountability and missed opportunities to enhance the performance and to improve value for money. Some contracts fail to adequately specify performance standards and objectives, thereby making it hard to hold service providers to account. In other cases, public sector agencies simply did not actively manage the contract, failing to adequately monitor performance or even to recognise and address underperformance. One service that business and government agencies alike often outsource is information technology services. This is despite this being a common practice and experience showing that it's extremely risky. And in this respect, to show we're not alone, I draw on a study by Oxford University's Professor Ben Flyberg, who found that ICT projects have a likely cost overrun of 350% when the project's worth 100 million euros or more. So that's about 120 million Australian dollars or more. The normative outcome is a 350% overrun. If that's not a prompt to actively manage, I don't know what is. When I look at our own records, since 2003, my office has published over a dozen reports focused on ICT. Our 9-10 audits found inadequate monitoring of performance of outsourced IT services, with 3 departments failing to use targets to monitor performance, and another 2 departments having no service level agreements in place with their providers. The extremely risky nature of ICT projects for the sector has been recognised by the Department of Treasury and Finance with their new high-value, high-risk project screening and review process. And this reinforces the existing gateway process that's been in place for some time. Encouragingly, around a dozen projects are now subject to this enhanced process. We've also found these shortcomings in contract design and management for other types of projects, including outsourcing of management of prison accommodation. In this audit, we looked at several contracts made across more than 10 years for prison service provision and found significant failures in contract design and management. Because some contracts did not adequately define accommodation services standards, the department struggled to effectively monitor contractor performance. In particular, it did not get assurance assets are being properly maintained. This is a significant shortcoming, as the asset, the prison, will eventually revert to state ownership. And because there is no monitoring of asset maintenance, it's likely the state will receive the asset back in poorer physical condition than expected. At Vargo, we also seek innovative approaches to our own practices, and last year we joined forces with the Ombudsman of Victoria. While we are limited by our current legislation from completely collaborative projects, the approach allowed us to capitalise on the experience of our 2 officers. The report tabled last November looked at ICT projects which often involved outsourcing and are particularly sensitive to governance problems. It found that a major issue when outsourcing government service is that large vendors are well versed in contract negotiations, putting relatively inexperienced public sector staff at a disadvantage. So I'd conclude on this hotspot that it demonstrates how important it is to have clear performance expectations in contracts and to actively manage these contracts. The next theme is in a similar vein, as it is about blurred accountability and oversight. The public sector is growing in size and increasingly embracing devolved and arm's length governance structures. These, what we term light touch arrangements, allow flexibility in operations, and they provide some authority to organisations for delivering public services, and in principle that's a good thing. I'd note, however, that this historical shift is a 180-degree turn away from the more central control and heavy-handed regulation we experienced in the 70s and 80s. The challenge that's emerged, however, is that we're now seeing accountability gaps of a different nature emerging as a consequence. Our audits consistently find a lack of oversight between large departments and their related portfolio entities that are responsible for delivery of related programs and services. Several audits in 2010-11 recommended that departments strengthen their oversight role and more actively monitor and respond to program and agency performance information. A kind of set and forget approach to devolved responsibility has hampered the achievement of important public programs. Sufficient oversight was a particular issue in the preparedness to respond to terrorism audit. This audit found a lack of clarity of roles and governance responsibilities between the lead agency, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and other departments, related committees, networks, the steering group and line agencies. We concluded there was confusion and gaps, with some departments unaware of their requirements under the legislation and the policy. We recommended that DPC strengthen its oversight and coordination. DPC, however, questioned this stronger role. In its follow-up of the audit, however, the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee affirmed our position and were direct in their thinking about the DPC's position. In the foreword, the Chair noted the committee was, quote, disappointed with the position taken by the Department of Premier and Cabinet in regards to its oversight and governance responsibilities, end quote, and went on further, and that DPC, quote, continues to dispute its obligations and responsibilities in coordinating, end quote, the effective oversight. As a consequence, the Chair concluded that DPC, and here I quote, had not adequately supported the Premier, end quote. So that's Parliament's judgment on a current view about an approach to program management. This overall deficit has also emerged in our audits of regulators, such as the Victorian Commission for Gambling Regulation and the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority. Another recent audit of the Building Commission and its regulatory role is a further example of a lack of purposeful management over an extended period. We first audited the Building Commission in 2000, 6 years after its establishment, and at that point we found and reported weaknesses in the Commission's monitoring role, including its identification of building control risks and the targeting of its monitoring and enforcement activities. An inquiry 5 years later by the Victorian Competition and Efficiency Commission again raised similar issues. Our most recent audit, the report of which was tabled in December last year, yet again found the same recurring issues. So despite it being 17 years since the Commission was first established, and at that point, counting our audit, 3 reviews, and I'd add on top of that also having 3 years notice of our intended 2011 audit, there remained no reasonable assurance over the integrity and reliability of the building control system. We concluded from that audit that the Commission's audit program was not providing adequate scrutiny over the effectiveness of building surveyors' works, and we pointed out the Commission's audits focused almost entirely on administrative matters, while compliance with the more critical safety and technical issues was not being systematically assessed. A further example that led to our conclusion is we selected a statistical sample of 401 permits to examine in detail, and 96% of those permits did not comply with the minimum statutory building and safety standards. So you can see a need for a stronger focus on accountability across the public sector in relation to both outsourced and in-house activities. And I come back to the adage that while you can devolve responsibility for tasks, as a program manager, you remain ultimately accountable for the performance, and you need to have sufficient oversight to satisfy yourself that things are being managed appropriately and as intended, so that you're then in a position to assure your management and external review bodies of the integrity of your operation. And this brings me to the third theme. Our audits often look at big ticket items, whether they be in dollar terms or community impact terms. And for example, the shortlist would be the desalination plant, the smart meter initiative, Mikey, major road and rail infrastructure projects. And in reviewing these, we repeatedly find that when we audit the planning and decision making behind these projects and significant business decisions, agencies are failing to make adequate use of available evidence and authoritative supporting information. In particular, business cases and options analyses are often incomplete, with crucial information lacking and poor quality evidence to support recommendations. Our audit of major road projects found significant weaknesses in forecasting traffic when planning the projects. This led to an overestimation of the benefits of proposed projects and gave decision makers false confidence about the success of the project. This audit also raised concerns about the reliability of cost estimates of different approaches. Sufficient assurance was not available that the most cost-effective approach had been adopted. This was because the estimated difference between choosing a public-private partnership or a state-financed public sector comparator was not reliable. In consequence, we don't know if the public money is being well spent. And as I mentioned earlier, a dollar wasted is a dollar not spent on other competing initiatives and projects. We've seen further examples of this deficiency across audits as diverse as business planning for major capital works in local government, procurement practices in the health sector, and planning for the provision of maternity services. In this latter example, our audit found the Department of Health's planning decisions for maternity services were not based on system-level knowledge of capacity. Therefore, the department could not demonstrate that the maternity services are being provided when and where needed. The consequence of this is that people in parts of Victoria where demand is increasing rapidly are not being provided with growth in capacity and thereby being disadvantaged. While a strong evidence base will not always be available for every issue government seeks to address, what information is available should be assembled and used to inform decision making. As I said earlier, in the private sector, performance is measured by the bottom line, profits and share price. In the absence of such measures such as profit and share price, performance measures and lead indicators are key methods of informing stakeholders about how well government has performed. Our next theme is about making sure these performance measures are meaningful. Many agencies report performance, but our audits repeatedly find that few report relevant, appropriate and useful performance measures and in an accessible way. For example, when looking at services for victims of crime, we found that while the Victim Support Agency did have a performance measure in place, it did not actually provide useful information to decision makers or to the public about the performance of the agency. Its sole performance measure was the number of victims receiving a service. Unfortunately, this measure was misleading because it gave equal weight to a 5-minute telephone call from a victim to that of a program of intensive ongoing counselling to a victim. Further, the measure didn't tell us anything about the quality of the service being provided. That is, whether the service provided was actually helping the victim. We found similar shortcomings in performance reporting about ambulance services, water entities, and more recently in our audit on government investment in biotechnology. In this last audit, we looked at the investment the Victorian government had made in the biotechnology sector, which was aimed at attracting more private investment and stimulating scientific research and innovation in Victoria. While 10 of the 16 goals had already been met and progress was made against those not met, the department did not gather sufficient performance data about delivery of the sought-after longer-term and strategic benefits. The result is that after more than 10 years of active investment, the department could not objectively demonstrate the development of a cause and effect relationship between its investment and the results achieved. While we can reasonably attribute some contribution to developments, we cannot begin to know the extent to which investment is contributing to achieving the sought-after outcome. So without useful performance information, it's difficult to know about the performance of the public sector and the effectiveness of government activities. Moving on to the next theme, there is much talk in the contemporary public sector about networked network governance models, where public projects are delivered in partnership with several parties. In practice, we find that these models are mostly used for community services, where councils, government departments, authorities and community bodies collaborate on delivering initiatives. However, governance can easily become confused and compromised in these joined-up projects. It seems at times that the more agencies involved, the harder it is to coordinate responsibilities and the more likely there will be lapses in accountability and failure to crystallise and address project risks. A number of audits identified these weaknesses and the risks in using joined-up arrangements. In the audit Revitalising Central Dandenong, we found that collaboration across government was not systemic or structured. This led to significant delays in implementation and, in consequence, to the achievement of the desired outcomes. And programs for local community transport services also found shortcomings with joined-up approaches. We found partnership issues in 3 of the 4 projects examined, and despite it being a condition of funding, 2 of these projects failed to enter into partnership agreements at all. Within government itself, there was limited cross-government coordination, and this further hindered the achievement of project outcomes. As the public sector continues to turn to such arrangements, especially for more qualitative community services, we need to be surer that these arrangements are clear to all involved and each party is fulfilling its respective responsibilities. As I mentioned earlier, the Victorian public sector is large and complex. Every year, Victoria's public sector agencies spend billions of dollars purchasing goods, services and assets. These purchases have an enormous impact on the delivery of programs and services. Given the importance of procurement, it is vital that it be well conducted and and that's the focus of the next theme. Probity in procurement is about fairness, impartiality and integrity of the process. Being consistent in your treatment of and interaction with potential suppliers is important in demonstrating that probity standards are met. Probity is also critical in achieving and demonstrating value for money, as potential suppliers will likely choose not to participate in tenders if they doubt the fairness or the impartiality of the process. In October 2011, we tabled a report on health purchasing Victoria, whose primary purpose is to conduct procurement on behalf of the health sector. Despite being a main legislative requirement, we found that HPV was not undertaking its probity assurance function. And without this assurance of probity, the department doesn't have the information necessary to understand whether the sector's procurement practices are being properly conducted, a significant shortcoming. We then went a step further in this audit and looked at examples of procurement by individual hospitals, which HPV is supposed to regulate. Our audit found that almost 1 in 5 hospitals audited had weaknesses in transparency and appropriateness of decision making. Given that hospitals' self-managed procurement accounts for almost 80% of the 1.6 billion, so that's just under 1.3 billion, the hospitals self-manage, this is very troubling, as it places the integrity of this part of the sector in doubt. Earlier I spoke about the independence of the Auditor-General, and to demonstrate my independence and objectivity, the next example is an audit of this university. And I don't want to shy away from sharing some important learnings from this audit, which speaks strongly to this theme. The University of Melbourne is currently in the midst of procuring a peak computing facility as part of a life sciences computational initiative. In respect to that, we ordered the planning and procurement of this facility. On a positive note, we found the procurement objective was consistent with both the government policy and the university's strategic and business objectives. Importantly also, early indications are that it is achieving these objectives. However, we concluded the procurement process itself was not well planned and that the university could not demonstrate that it represented value for money or delivered value for money. The main reason for this was that it only attracted one company capable and willing to partner it in the initiative. We concluded that opportunities to retest the market had not been taken. While the audit found no impropriety, there was insufficient transparency and accountability for such a large public sector procurement. It is critical that procurement by the public sector is well conducted. Not only is it about achieving value for money, but also about demonstrating the integrity of the sector, about stakeholders being able to trust the public sector. The next theme is an issue I've seen come up year after year throughout my time as Auditor-General in Victoria and before that in Western Australia. The public sector has relied on financial and information systems for a long time now, and yet audits continue to highlight weaknesses in these systems. The risks from these systems can be a blind spot for management and another governance hotspot. In 10-11, our financial audits highlighted the need for agencies to strengthen controls around information, communication and technology system security. Audits repeatedly revealed system weaknesses such as poor controls over passwords and remote systems access. We also drew attention to limited monitoring of the integrity of security systems. These gaps increase the risk of unauthorised access to departmental information and has been the subject of repeated recommendations by my office over the years. These issues, I stress, were not solely technological. We can't just pass it off and blame the IT people. Governance and cultural weaknesses also place key systems and important information at risk. In some cases, these at-risk systems have a significant impact on the safety and the quality of life for thousands of Victorians. Our security of infrastructure control systems for water and transport audit found that the risk of unauthorised access to water and transport systems is high. Specifically, operators did not have effective processes to manage the security risks to their infrastructure control systems. Further, they did not have physical and electronic controls to detect and prevent inappropriate access to the systems, nor did they have appropriate governance arrangements in place, such as risk and business continuity management, to assure management that systems were secure. As I've already said, we've been using such systems for years, and it is imperative that the public sector protect these systems and information. As we move more and more information onto such systems, including now onto web-based systems which are particularly exposed, managers must address the risks that arise out of using this technology, which, while offering the potential for far more efficient and effective processing, brings with it substantial risks that need to be managed. The final theme for tonight came from our most recent round of financial audits. One of the things we look at when conducting a financial audit is the financial sustainability of an entity. To be financially sustainable, entities need to be able to meet their current and future expenditure as it falls due. They also need to be able to absorb foreseeable changes and financial risks as they materialise. We found some worrying signs when it came to financial sustainability, with entities failing to generate enough cash to sustain their operations or maintain their assets. As we look more closely at this issue, we started to find that broader issues around funding models and governance might be leading to these sustainability issues. This is around 2 decades after we adopted accrual accounting for the sector. In the health sector, we rated 1/3 of public hospitals as high risk in relation to financial sustainability, mainly because they generated insufficient cash to adequately fund their operations. To receive a clear audit opinion, these hospitals had to be provided with a letter of comfort from the department that it would provide adequate cash to enable them to meet their obligations should this be required. Our analysis found that funding arrangements had a direct and significant impact on the financial sustainability of hospitals. The funding model limits the ability of governing bodies and management to make decisions around asset maintenance and replacement. Compounding this, major hospitals consistently experienced cash shortages. For water entities, water funding and pricing models may no longer be appropriate or sufficiently flexible in times of changing weather conditions. The 19 water entities developed their current water plans during a time of ongoing drought, with around a decade of below average rainfall and water restrictions. Now, however, following a period of above average rainfall and with water storages nearing capacity, especially in regional Victoria, there is a risk that assumptions in the existing water plans are no longer appropriate and that revenue and expenditure will not be as forecast. This could adversely affect the financial sustainability of these entities and needs to be actively managed. So that brings me to the conclusion. As I complete our list of the 2010-11 governance hotspots, I've been heartened by the broad interest in these high-level themes and hope to see a reduction in the incidence of these common challenges and weaknesses over time. I'd also like to give credit to the Department of Treasury and Finance for continuing each year to prepare for the Minister for Finance a response to VAGO's audits on behalf of the whole public sector. This gives us an extra layer of accountability and gives me greater confidence that the sector is addressing our audit findings. This key audit themes resource, in tandem with our 4-year rolling annual plan, also reinforces the unique and enviable position occupied by public service managers who seek to drive improvement and better manage risk in their organisations. I leave you with the thought that the ability to be able to access the audit findings of peer organisations and to have a definitive 4-year program of audits is a privilege that many in the private sector would envy. I urge public sector managers, as well as academics and policy researchers, to make the most of this privilege and learn from the lessons of others as we strive to more purposefully manage the delivery of intended policy and program outcomes in the public interest. Thank you.
Well, a huge amount to think about there. So while you're all gestating that and thinking about your questions, I like Grant to give us a head start on the discussion.
Well, it's all pretty stuffed really, isn't it? I think I'd just like to start by putting some things in context, and I think Des would agree with me. Like, the Victorian public sector delivers $50 billion worth of services to the community of Victoria every year, and the overwhelming majority of that is done at a high quality level and makes a significant difference to the people of Victoria. What we're talking about here is how we can actually do that a bit better going forward. And I must say, in Treasury, we think that the innovation of the Auditor-General of putting out themes every year has been a significant step forward, because it's been able to give us something to focus on, because for years we've been doing responses to individual reports, but having a process where we start trying to get above the individual recommendations into what's systemic in the public sector is quite important. And I know in a number of areas like information security, broader information technology management, which have been themes for a number of reports, we've been able to draw on the Auditor-General's themes and try and start putting in place systemic reforms in those areas. And performance information, which is a key theme through this report, has been something that we're working on an ongoing basis. What I thought I might do, though, is to talk about some of the things that the Auditor-General's raised. I thought I might try and put some of these things in an historic context, because Des and I talk about this stuff a lot, as you could imagine, and Des likes to identify problems and say that I should fix them. I like to think about things in the context of improvement over a medium term, and we have a bit of a disconnect, because he'd like it all done now and I'd like to systemically drive it through time, and he's more impatient than me, I think, is the way you describe it. But if you look at the trends in public sector management and performance management over the last 2 decades, I think, or last 3 or 4 decades, there's been 2 primary trends. The first has been a move to greater devolution in service delivery, and a lot of the themes that Des talked about were around this move to greater devolution. Why have we been pushing devolution? Largely because it's pretty clear cut that centralised planning and control isn't the right way to deliver services to communities. If you try and do things in a highly centralised, monopolistic way, you get inefficiencies and you can't tailor services to the delivery of the community. You can't drive efficiency, you can't drive innovation to the same extent you can if you have a more devolved approach. And the evidence base for that's pretty strong, and we've been trying to roll out this approach to devolution probably since the late 80s. The other theme has been, well, if we're moving down that path, how do we hold entities more strongly to account while we're doing devolution? And what you've seen in the public sector is us moving from the 70s on, from an input management regime, and trying to build a performance and accountability regime that sits around devolved approaches and can get best outcomes. So, we went from input management which we were concerned didn't have a strong enough results focus, to program management. Program management, we found, basically described things that we were trying to do but didn't really have any hard performance information on it. 90s, we tried to implement output management, describing the things that we were doing, and sort of got a fair way into doing that through the early 2000s, and people started to ask the obvious question, well, what are you doing it for? You don't just produce outputs for their own sake, you're trying to make an impact in the public sector. So we started talking around outcomes. And through all of this time, we've been changing the sort of metrics of what we measure in terms of performance. And why mention this history? I suppose it's because of that. Some of the things that I think the Auditor-General identifies in the reports are us trying to catch up with a changing performance management system through time, trying to improve it, make it better as we go along. What is the lesson that I take from where we've got to at the moment? Well, one, you can't do devolution without accountability, and systematically through the themes that come out in the Auditor-General's report. The problems that are identified are around having devolved responsibility, not enough accountability around that. The more fundamental thing is that as we've moved from inputs to outcomes, what's become absolutely clear is it's not an either or, and the system that we need in place to effectively manage public sector and get effective performance information in place needs to make sure that the public service is accountable for the resources that they have at hand, the effective use of those resources, that is looking at inputs, that they're accountable for delivering the services that they're supposed to be delivered, outputs, and that those services are put together in a way which achieves the outcomes that's meant. Now, a lot of the themes that Des talked about were around performance management, and he talked a lot about sort of breakdowns in accountability. And one of the things that I think we've identified is that we're actually reasonably good at getting an idea of what impact we want to have, the outcomes. We're okay when we go from that to interfacing with the service deliverer, trying to define what it is that we want delivered. You know, we can put some definition around outputs, and particularly where we've outsourced those things, we've got better at doing it. When we insource them, we're probably still quite weak at defining the output that we want. The problem has been the contract management phase, and most of, I think, the issues that Auditor-General's reports raise are, you know, we've got to get better at the front end defining the products that we want, but the key thing is once we've defined the product, whether we're insourcing it or outsourcing it, making sure it's delivered, making sure we have the performance information there for it to be delivered so that we can hold people to account and basically assure that we're getting what we want. The second element of it, which goes into the evidence base, are we then evaluating what's going on, making sure that when we make decisions to buy it again next time, we know it's going to have the impact that we want it to have. So I think there's a sort of theme through all of that, which I'd draw together as basically the public sector needs to get better at contract management or commissioning service delivery. You know, we tried to move in the output phase of performance management when we tried to define outputs to get into a concept of contracting. The whole language is around purchaser provider, and we never really embedded that before we moved on to an outcome process. So the purchaser provider contract thing is about defining the product up front and holding people to account as you go through. It's not necessarily about outsourcing, but it is about making sure whether you've got an in-source provider, you know, a school or a hospital, or an outsized provider, an IT trained company, whatever, you define the things up front and move on to do that. So I think the lessons in there are pretty clear, and I think they're work in progress. The difference between Des and I on this thing is around timing of achieving that. It's something that requires a fair amount of reskilling, I think, for public sector managers to think of themselves more and more about sort of commissioning work and holding people to account for that, and not just about the outcomes involved. The other theme I'd like to talk about a little bit is the concept around regulation and light touch regulation that are picked up in some of the Auditor-General's reports. I actually think the issues there are roughly the same issues that we've got in performance management generally. It's pretty clear to me that moving from hard regulation where you insist that people do things one way and that they're wrong unless they do it that way, heavy-handed regulation, is something that our economy can't afford. We need to move to regulatory environments which are lighter touch, which use market mechanisms more to achieve outcomes. But if we're going to go down that path, you need to have the regulators defining not only the regulatory framework they put in place and the holding themselves to account to implementing that framework, and some of the reports Des talked about were ones where people had them in place but didn't hold themselves to account for that, But they've also got to define the risk framework that we're operating in, because light touch regulation is risk-based regulation, and part of the way that you ensure that you're getting what you're asking for is if you're putting in place a regulatory environment which allows sort of 10% exceptions, and that's an accepted risk environment, then that's got to be clear up front when you establish the framework. So when the Auditor-General comes along and says, aha, there's 10% exceptions, you could say, well, that's what we expected. That's the framework. But a lot of our policy environments don't do that at the moment. They actually treat a light touch regulation like it might be a heavy touch regulation. I think there's a lot of learnings in those reports about how you drive that. The final observation I'll make, to keep this short, is around the issue about sustainability of government entities. And this is probably the one area where I just basically disagree with the audit reports. And I think the reason I disagree is largely my own fault. And that's because I don't think in defining our corporate governance frameworks for public sector entities like hospitals and TAFEs, etc., we've actually made it really clear what we're dealing with these entities. The Auditor-General comes in and does an audit of these agencies and says they're cash constrained, they don't have enough money to meet their future needs. And the fact is, a lot of them are like that. But the other fact is that they've got a 50 billion turnover entity with $200 billion worth of assets sitting right behind them, who needs that entity to deliver year in, year out, and will ensure that at the end of the day, the cash is there to keep the business going. Or it will be a very explicit decision by the government to allow a hospital to go broke. That's a pretty big call. So when we set up our financing frameworks for hospitals and TAFEs and water authorities, we actually know we're going to run them pretty cash constrained, because they're not in a competitive market, they're not in an environment where you can use the pressures of competition and market finance to generate efficiency, so we tend to use cash as a bit of an efficiency lever. That's pretty rough, but that's roughly what we do with them. So you keep entities cash constrained, you don't fund their depreciation. Yes, that means that they lose a bit of control about their asset investment, but it also keeps them on the tight leash you need in entities which are not in a market environment. And I think one of the lesson that I take out of that particular example is Treasury and other organisations need to be a lot clearer when we set up our corporate boards about exactly what we expect from them. And for most of those entities, the boards don't determine their capital program. The government determines the capital program, because the government rations cash across the whole of government. We don't allow them to build up big bank accounts. We don't allow them to do those things, because at the end of the day, cash is king in a big corporation. That's how we operate. So I accept everything he says about what the measures say. I don't actually accept the conclusion that we have a pile of entities that are about to go broke, because the evidence will be they won't go broke, but we do need to do something about the governance framework. So they're my basic reflections on it. There's a lot of doom in Auditor-General's reports. I think we also need to concentrate a lot on the positives of all of those reports that aren't written about wonderful things that we do. And the journey that we're on in getting a better public sector is actually a journey. It's not sort of fix it tomorrow and it's all better. There's a lot of work to be done. We need to get better at performance management, and I think that's a big challenge for us in the next few years. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. It feels to me, what I'm hearing is that there's a number of almost inexorable tensions here between what auditors want and expect and what those in charge of trying to make things work feel is both reasonable and proportionate. I've got a huge number of questions I'd like to ask, but this isn't my forum, this is your forum. So Erin should be around here somewhere. She's at the back. Erin's got the microphone. We've got about half an hour or so for questions, so we can really get stuck into this here. So who would like to start? Maybe back there.
I'm Maria from the City of Melbourne. We were involved in a VARGO audit recently. I think it's a fantastic tool for communities to understand exactly what governments are doing to support their needs. I'm curious about the complexity between good governance performance and then politics. Okay?
Yep.
Because when in the Kennett era schools were shut down, okay, there were real issues around, you know, what you're describing in terms of the performance of the government of the day. So that dilemma, okay, and it is a wicked dilemma, you know, how does that work in terms of what you're doing in VARGO and what happens in that environment?
Okay, so we're starting with a nice easy question then. How do we manage the tension between regulation and politics? Who'd like to pick up on that one?
I'll start off on it. It may be I'm a traditional public servant, but I think that's one area where our underlying principles need to be respected and maintained. At the end of the day, as a public servant, our job is to serve our political masters. But equally, as public servants, we're charged with providing them with frank and fearless advice. And that can be interpreted in terms of providing them with the comprehensive information. And on one of my governance hotspots, I mentioned the thing about the relevant information and available information. And to me, the first step is for agencies to be able to demonstrate they assembled the available, you know, the rationally available information and made it available to the decision maker. And again, I've been out of advising ministers for 20 years now, but when I go back to it, you assemble the information, you made your recommendation, but it was up, the minister was entitled to take a decision, was at variance with your recommendation, but provided you'd provide them with comprehensive and reliable advice, your duty then was to implement what they decided. And I suppose I'll get into speculation here, but I fear, as in modern times we've done things a lot more speedily, we've tried to serve our political masters, I think we might be dropping the ball a bit on that element of the public servant's responsibility to also serve the broader community, because we're there, you know, as servicing the government, not as subservient. You know, it's hard to differentiate between that subservient, servile approach of do as you're told. We're professionals, we should be providing the range of advice and options and making it transparent so that when that decision's taken, you can assign responsibility. I'm not sure from a practising
I agree
advice.
with what you say, and I think after my experience in the public service, you know, our job as public servants is, as Des said, to provide the best possible advice to governments to make decisions. And the public may make, every individual in the public may come to a conclusion about whether they think a particular policy is right or wrong. From a public servant's point of view, it actually doesn't matter. And if it starts to matter, then there's another career that should roll out for you, because the role of a public servant is to implement the decisions of government, to advise them and to do that. And I think the Victorian public service is incredibly strong in that perspective. It's very professional, it's apolitical, it delivers good policy advice. Probably on occasions better evidence base would be good. Sometimes the speed of decision making might be slowed down to assist that, but everything's got its environment around it. And you know, I rarely see governments making stupid decisions, to tell you the truth.
That might elicit a reaction. Okay, who would like to ask the next question?
Bill Chandler, citizen, so as not to implicate either myself or anyone else. It's fascinating, there are two quite different worldviews. On the one hand, you're telling us the last 20, 30 years, things are getting better, we just need to be patient and it'll be fine. I hear Des saying what I describe as something which is significant failure. Now, if I get that wrong, tell me. But what I'd like to ask, I suppose, is the question really following on from the last one. Before each election, the parties put forward their promises. In government, they then instruct the public service. How do you then reconcile what is obviously a tension, my experience of the public service and outside the public service, is that it's not always, what's the phrase, fast and fearless? No, it's not fast and fearless, that's another word. You know what I mean? So how is that dealt with? And my experience also is that governments do sometimes make some stupid decisions, and decel is a word that comes to mind, but I won't go on about that.
Maybe I should start the answer on gross failures or whatever. Clearly the things we are raising, and including our reports, are significant. They're matters of significance, they're identifiable failings. Now, I'm the first to admit the world is not perfect, and probably this is a bit where a little bit of tension with Grant and I might come. It's how long can the system wait, and is it one response or one step at a time? Again, I suppose I draw on experience of others and try and learn from that. And when I look at private sector managers, they tend not to come with just a strategic approach. There's a short-term approach and there's longer-term things. So I suppose I would raise that the thrust of the hotspots that I've gone through point at one level require a bit of a shock adjustment or whatever to get real about delivery. Because I'd agree with Grant that the sector is quite good at establishing frameworks, articulating policies, with my professional colleagues here, without giving an audit opinion, we're pretty good on setting up and writing contracts. But what our audits show is that in operation we tend not to manage them in delivery. And part of that is the public sector. There's excess demand, limited resources, so you're always rationing and you're going to move on from one important thing to another. But I suppose my reading is there is significant scope for some basic management 101, hands-on management stimulus required to get those low-level ones. And I've got a personal thing as a career public servant. My hypothesis is we've lost a bit of our stature or respect, and we need to reassert that, and that will come with exercising sound judgment and defending it in an operational sense.
I really had a question about financial sustainability, which I'll get to in about 3 nanoseconds, but I'm tempted to just ask if there's any career advice, Des, you'd like to offer any of my colleagues in a certain department, when there is a bit of pressure put upon them, when, for example, interpreting what the planning scheme would suggest you might want to do with a rezoning, proposed or otherwise, and how does a public servant still offer that best professional advice without fear or favour? So that's a little preliminary, if I may. But my question was really about financial sustainability, and there was that comment about, public transport, Mikey, and hospitals, financial sustainability of hospitals. And it just strikes me from a tram ride I had down Nicholson Street a few weeks back. Imagine all the solar panels you could put on the north-facing side of St Vincent's and what that would do to obliterate your electricity bill. So is there much exploration of how that kind of investment in renewable energy could just get rid of your electricity bill for the year? And in Mikey, I haven't got access to all the information that you would, but I'd love to do a cost-benefit analysis of, and please don't shoot me just yet, but it strikes me that if you increase the vehicle registration cost by about $50 or $100, lose the Mikey altogether, lose those ridiculous MIT cards that I never have the right change for. A girl's got enough to organise in a handbag as it is, and you would get four more seats on the tram. So if you looked at generating an income stream from the motorists, who are often at the same time public transport users as well, or it's still in their vested interest to have a congestion problem solved. So can you see where I'm going with this kind of cost-benefit analysis of other ways of funding viable, seriously groovy public transport, just as a financial viability test? Thank you.
Right. I'll have a go at answering that in two streams. One is in terms of the frank and fearless advice, and the second is in terms of those, I'll call them policy options, and quickly opt out of those because as auditor, I'm specifically precluded from commenting on the policy objectives of government. That's what governments are elected for. It's a single answer to both those questions, and that's why I'm really pushing for performance reporting, enhanced performance reporting, because it is a real challenge. There's no denying my corollary with the private sector. It's bottom line profit or share price is a pretty good default or de facto. We don't have that in the public sector, but I'd like to see that where we've gone with financial reporting in the last 20 years and adoption of accrual accounting, and I tell the story against myself when I was equivalent of a CFO in a Commonwealth department in the early 80s, I thought I was pretty good, but we didn't do annual financial statements, we didn't do an annual report. Your sole thing was getting a budget and then going to estimates committee and explaining it. So that's where I will agree with Grant that the quality of administration has improved. But what I think we're really lacking is some form of comprehensive performance reporting. And the examples I used in my presentation show how basic we are, where despite the best intentions, what's there is not very informative. And I think that comes back. But to your fundamental thing about giving advice without fear or favour, I know there will be pressures, but I think that's where we've got to take the approach as a public servant. We're a true public servant. We either resist that pressure, and if we can't, we move to somewhere where it's not an issue. But in terms of those various policy options, I think that really comes down to the quality of performance reporting, because you'll start and get those questions answered, whether solar panels and electricity or alternative means of providing the transport. But by making that transparent, because we're in basically a rationing thing, I don't have a lot of sympathy for Grant very often, but as he comes into a budget, I do, because there's just excess demand here, and there's a limited resource here. And we've already seen it in the questions tonight. There'll be a diversity of opinions as to whether decel is a good thing or a bad thing, and things like that. So that's the vibrancy and the health of our democracy.
Well, with respect to the environmental thing, DT have actually run a program for departments where they can borrow forward against their appropriation to implement sustainable initiatives. So for things like that, if they think that they can get a return by reducing their electricity bill, they can get access to effectively a cheap loan to do that. And we've run that out over about the last 3 years, and I can't remember how much we've done. It's $50 million or something worth of investment for departments on that type of stuff. I think the rate of the return for solar panels would be too long. I suspect it's probably 10 or 15 years, and most departments wouldn't be willing to sort of borrow out that long. But for a lot of other green initiatives, there's been quite a bit of interest in our program. On the public transport thing, I think the public transport fares bring in, I think, about $700 million, $800 million a year. If you wanted to get rid of that, you need to double rego, and because that's about what it brings in a year. And I'm sure there'd be some people in the community who think that's a great thing, and some people who think it's a bad thing, and politicians will make the decision about whether it's a good idea or not.
Okay, there's a lady there in green.
Thank you very much. It's Linda Hancock from Deakin University. I'm interested in the speakers saying a bit more about what they mean by light touch regulation and how we improve accountability. I mean, obviously the reports that we've been hearing about and the fantastic analysis is a sign of the robust strength of our democratic system, that we can even talk about these things. But how do we make it better? There was an implication that light touch is one thing and heavy touch we can't do because there aren't the resources. But in fact, the Auditor-General's reports are more about the light touch being that it's the wrong focus and the wrong emphasis, and that they're measuring and reporting and performing on the wrong things. And so I'd like your comments about gambling and alcohol, because they're going into a new combined regulator that's meant to fix up some of the light touch and get us back to responsible service of alcohol, public safety and responsible gambling. So if you can give some comments about that.
Okay, I'm happy to open the batting on that. From time to time, we, within the office, when we think about light touch regulation, in practice we find it really means no touch. And it really comes back to lack of purposeful management. And I relate to what Grant was saying earlier. If I go back to the 70s, it was very detailed, procedural, and you must do everything. What we've done is we've gone to, and the term Grant used I relate to, is risk-based regulation, and it's working out what really matters and making sure that's done right, and then having a greater tolerance on the things at the fringe. And so it's being discriminating and discerning in the application and guided by the outcome. And I suppose, like I mentioned, the VRQA audit, they had a very challenging task ahead of them with a problem in the delivery, a lot of private providers as well as government providers. And in broad terms, they engaged a range of people who they called auditors and told them to go and audit. And now that's a bit of a gross overstatement, but that's basically what they did. The consequence was every auditor did it their own way, and then it was compounded that when the reports came in, they were all on a different basis, so they couldn't begin to compare, contrast and work out what the underlying message was. So that's what I really mean about risk-based regulation, is purposefully managing it against achieving the stated objective, which ranges across a range of things, and checking the things that matter and exercising the judgment. And again, I relate to Grant's comment in his response, is as the auditor, we'd welcome coming in and finding a reasoned rationale for what is the tolerance for exceptions. And like in my own office, we've got it in terms of the issue of opinions on financial statements. We've got a zero tolerance for a wrong opinion. If we don't get them 100% right, that's a fatal flaw. But in terms of a typo in the transmittal letter, I don't like it, but you can wear that. You want to minimise it, but they're the two extremes. And what we're not seeing when we do the audit is that level of discrimination, and I've oversimplified it even in this response.
I think we agree largely on this, what's light touch or heavy touch. The bottom line is when you undertake regulation, what you're trying to do is achieve an outcome. The first thing you've got to do is specify the outcome that you want, and then look at the way of achieving that outcome which imposes the least burden on the community to do so. Drive it as efficiently as possible. What we've found is that for a lot of regulation, people go in the past, and it still happens in the present, the regulators go for the thing that's easiest for them, not necessarily the thing that's easiest for the community in undertaking it. I'll give you an example. At the moment, this is the regulation of the Commonwealth of the States. At the moment, we have all of these Commonwealth state agreements that we sign up to and we have to produce reports on. There's one particular agreement which requires reporting twice a year against the performance of it, for which Western Australia gets $17,000 a year. $17,000 a year for an agreement signed which they have to report twice a year. That will cost them more than $17,000 to get the money. That's not light touch regulation. It's not achieving best possible outcomes. I know that's one within government stuff, but you see this between government and the private sector all the time. We've got to get the burden down and focus on the outcome. Sometimes the outcome that we want, the burden that it imposes on the community is too great. So governments have to do a trade-off between bringing the outcome down to get the cost benefit of these things right. That's what smart regulation's about. Light touch regulation is about reducing the impact on the community. It could end up being quite heavy, but at least it should work through the cost benefit of things before you get there.
Okay, question here.
Hi, Susie Goldsmith, University of Melbourne. Just sort of continuing on that theme then about getting the burden down and the outcome up, can you make some comment about involvement of federal regulators? So the COAG moves on, say, bringing into a sort of a federal sense some of the regulatory roles that are currently performed in the states, and also perhaps even more complex in terms of understanding that perhaps the rationale for that is about reducing burden, but in terms of boosting outcome, perhaps the argument for the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and how that will get sort of translated into some form of implementation operationally in the states.
Well, thanks, Des.
Well, I was thinking about the oversight role as well.
I don't know much about the Murray Basin Plan stuff, so I can't really comment on that. At a generic level, I think that there are, when we talk about rationalising regulation and centralising it versus decentralising it, you're dealing with two competing issues in that space. One is the concept of a seamless national economy, and whether if you get a single regulatory framework across the whole of the country, you can drive efficiencies. And that's the sort of economies of scale argument with respect to regulation. You make it easier for business and for the community because then you have to deal with one framework. Then you've got the competition overlay you've got to put on that. If you go down the path of a single approach, does that reduce the dynamism of competition for change? So you've got to look at each process and say, well, what's more important, economies of scale or dynamism? Because in a dynamic system where you've got different states doing different things and copying off each other and changing, you're more likely to get change than a single national system where you don't have that type of process going. So most of the things that we work through at the moment about looking at whether they should be done nationally or at a state or some mix of the two, it's a balance between those two things. Then you've got a political perspective as well, but I think from a public service perspective, they're the sort of analytics you've got to bring to making decisions about what to centralise and what not to. An example that we did a few years ago in Treasuries was on payroll tax, where we made a decision to make all of the definitions of payroll the same across Australia, so it'd be easier for businesses to fill out forms, but we left all of the rates and exemptions and all of the policy elements different because we thought you get the economies of scale in the single approach to definition of what a payroll is, but the competition comes in rates and exemptions and things like that. And they seem to me to be the two key things that you have to think about. So, but I can't talk about Murray-Darling Basin, I'm sorry.
That's okay. You're not obliged to talk about the Murray-Darling Basin every forum. Okay, we've got another one here.
Irene Buzo from Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. I'm interested in point number 5 on the slides about managing risks from collaborative projects between government departments and community services. Des, you mentioned that governance can become confused and compromised, and you mentioned, lack of rigorous agreements, lack of timely outcomes. We actually encourage these kind of partnerships because we think they really meet community needs better. Is there anything that can be done to, improve that kind of thing?
I think it's in the application. I want to be a little bit rude and say we're very good at collaboration, but too often we forget to appoint a captain or a coach, so that when we come along and do an audit, people are collaborating, but nobody's taking the decision. So, and again, in the example I use there, I think we're in 4 projects where there were supposed to be partnership agreements. You come along auditing 3-5 years on, and there's not an underpinning partnership agreement. So it really just comes back to purposeful management of get the agreement in place and then honour it in operation.
One over here.
And there's one in the middle up there too.
Mark Smith from EPA Victoria. I'm just curious about reporting meaningfully on performance and the importance that will obviously play in future decision making. Des, this is probably more for you. If you could comment perhaps on whether this is due to a lack of understanding or confidence in the departments to report on that, whether it's to do with perhaps fudging figures or misrepresenting them to ensure funding, or whether it's all political.
No, I'll be a bit rude again and say I think it's because we let ourselves tell us it's too hard and therefore we don't even try. Against my background, I'd prefer to see us try and fail and realise we went in the wrong direction and then try something else, because I've got two reservations. We either talk too long about it and get into theory and never actually try and test it, or we just decide it is far too hard and therefore we're not even going to begin. And it takes me back to that old saying, if you don't know where you're going, you don't need a map, and it comes back to Grant's thing about decide what the objectives are. And I think that's an important thing in the public sector, because too often our objectives are longer term. When you get in the health, welfare, education area, some of them are generational. So if you need to also stage it and say, well, that's where I want to go, but the lead indicator is going to be, I expect it to be something positive or negative happen here and there. And my approach is probably a prototyping approach is needed, whereas I'm seeing very much more a very sophisticated intellectual argument that concludes, it's all too hard and therefore we won't do it. And when I put my taxpayer hat on, I say, well, in that case, why do we keep throwing money at it?
Can I just add to that? I think you've also got to know what you're going to do as well as where you're going, which is the output side of things. And we get stuck up with, in the outcome framework, the high-level performance measures about whether they're accurate or not. And I'm with Des, I think you're better off getting a pile of information together and at least trying to assess things rather than saying, well, this is distortionary or this isn't true because of this or that. You don't drive, you won't, if you've got no information, if you've got no map, you don't know where you're going, you don't need a map. That's basically it.
And again, I think this comes back to the public service as a profession reasserting, its intellect and approach. I think we've got to articulate that, look, this is someone else mentioned gambling and alcohol. Very challenging social and economic issues, and there's not an easy answer. But if you assemble your options, logically decide which one you're going to chase and why, and then react to either the intended or anticipated outcome, or if you're not getting the anticipated outcome, revisit and look at other options. So I sort of see it as applying the same basic principles, but with different outturns.
Okay, we've got time
There's one
for a
half
couple more.
Valerie.
Yeah.
Valerie, John.
Thank you. I'm Valerie Chong from the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, Parliament of Victoria. I've just got a question for Des. Thank you for a very informative and updated session tonight. Just drawing on your very vast experiences as Auditor-General in other jurisdictions, and perhaps also your sharing of experiences with your fellow colleagues, other Auditor-Generals on the Australasian Council of Auditor-Generals. I'm just wondering whether you could conclude that the hotspots you've identified within the Victorian public sector, whether those issues are common and pervasive across all jurisdictions, or are they unique in Victoria?
Look, on balance, I'd have to say they're generally pervasive. There'd be different accentuations in different jurisdictions, but no, they're fairly logical shortcomings, and I think part of our motivation in putting them forward is just to heighten the awareness of them, because some of them, especially coming down to identifying underperformance and addressing it, that's in an outsourced or a insourced, that's basic management. And I think the bigger the system, sometimes the more that's an issue, because the feedback loop's not as direct, or managers aren't across things in as much detail. But that's another area I agree with Grant. It's not that Victoria is particularly bad or whatever, but I think we all aspire to be in the leading public sector. And the way to be in the leading public sector is to avoid the obvious pitfalls and deal with the real challenges.
I think the only thing I would want to say, coming from the UK and with experience of a whole set of different countries, is that one of the things that this session, one of the things that appealed to me about this session was when I saw some of Des's notes in a previous article, was exactly that they seem to speak to issues that are globally relevant. You know, this is not just about specific issues for Victoria. These are things that public services and public service servants are grappling with in all sorts of different places. And so it's fascinating to me that what's happening in Victoria is that you have an auditor and a public service that are trying to grapple with these things in a number of different ways. And I think that's incredibly refreshing and something that is really to be commended. We've got time for one more question, I think, because I know people need to be elsewhere, and I would like at least some of you to have the opportunity to participate in the reception. So there was a hand here, or has that hand gone? Is it you? Yeah, just here, Erin.
I note the Auditor-General's comment that we are functioning in an increasingly complex social environment. I also note the goals of government include building a fairer Victoria with a focus on caring communities, vibrant democracy, strong families, and vibrant communities. I also note that there's a high cost, financial cost, of neglecting these areas. Some of these costs, for instance, to health, are noted in Vic Health's reports. They're noted by Victoria Police, and they're noted by organisations that manage security. So my question to the Auditor-General is, does VAGO look at the government's performance over these targets or goals as well?
Yes, the short answer is in selecting our audit topics, we're having regard to those government-stated goals, and we try and identify programs to be audited that are going to be catalytic in the achievement of those goals. And again, across those 5 broad areas, our audits are reasonably spread. So we try and apportion our resources not just on the hard economic things, but on the softer community, social and welfare issues. And again, that's in our topic selection, apart from canvassing widely, engaging with stakeholders, the people we audit, peak bodies, researchers, anyone who we think can contribute to our consideration. We also, at the audit level, we assess what we call risk and materiality, risk of things going wrong and the significance of them going wrong, and we try and look at it in both economic terms, dollar terms, and community impact terms. And like the example I used tonight about the victims of crime, that's probably only a $10 or $15 million a year program that financially would never look at us with 160 people reviewing the work of 200,000. You're just not going to get that level of granularity. But when you look at the impact of crime in the community and the non-economic consequences, that's how it gets on our program. So again, we are trying to get an even, an equitable spread, given that we're also rationing review resources. And again, that's probably another reason why we welcome these sort of presentations. It helps the managers with the checklist of basic things to look for, but it's also a prompt, I think, to executive government, because it's a balance. Our prime role stops with providing assurance. Technically, I could sleep well at night by signing off saying I've done my audits and I've made the report to Parliament and forget about it. But I think there's that little bit extra effort of extending it and explaining it to the community. And also I think there's, what I'm trying to encourage within executive government is a bit more leadership and direction from the centre and from senior management to draw together this very large and complex public sector, that without that structured drawing together and filtering or distillation process, we're going to have the diseconomy of all the silos with people individually trying to do the right thing, but it's not being joined up.
Grant, do you want to add to that?
I think one of the key roles of government is to, within the ambit of the things that it's responsible for, make all the trade-offs and choices about what's the most important for the community. And you see that reflected in the policy and resource allocation of government. And that's a core role of departments like Treasury and Department of Premier and Cabinet, is about helping governments make resource allocations decisions about competing needs and wants of the community. As Des said at the beginning of his presentation, there's one thing for certain: state government or federal governments will never meet all of the desires of the community, and the job of government is to try and distill out what's important for the community, what's important for them, and allocate resources to achieve those outcomes in the best way it can. And that's incredibly difficult, because most of what we do in government is produce free goods where the rationing device is a queue. And how you construct the queue is a highly political thing. And whether it be in the community services or in education or in economic services, construction of the queue for government activities is probably one of the most challenging things we do.
Okay. I'm not going to make any attempt to sum up that incredibly rich conversation, but I do want to say three things before we finish. It seems to me that we've talked about light touch and heavy touch, but what both Des and Grant have really been pushing us towards is really identifying the right touch. That's what they seem to be saying to me about how we can do better in terms of thinking through and operationalising both regulation and performance. There are inevitably going to be tensions, and Grant has alerted us to the range of tensions that public servants and public managers deal with every day. I think I'm interested in two other things. One, the difference there seems to me between both Des and Grant's assertion and indeed almost willing people both in this room and beyond to have confidence both in and as public servants, and a sense that I was getting from the audience that actually maybe there are public servants in the room who don't really feel that the service has confidence in them. And I think there's something interesting going on there that needs to be explored. And I think lastly, from the point of view of somebody who's involved in the Masters of Public Policy and Public Management here at the University of Melbourne, it's some really important messages for me to take away about making sure that what we teach in our courses reflects some of the key principles that both Des and Grant have been alerting us to. I'm pretty confident that we do, but I'm sure that we can do more, and that we need to be working with our cohorts to identify specifically some of the areas that Des and Grant have talked about. So those are the three of the things immediately that I'm going to take away from tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming and participating so fully. Please do stay and have a drink and some fancy food if you can. It would be very welcome. But most of all, I'd like to thank Grant and Des for giving of their time and for participating in this discussion so frankly and fearlessly. Thank you very much.